Yeah, that is fun. We should have more trash talking podcasts. It's much more fun than circling around a certain topic.
Yeah, a trash talking podcast doesn't mean what you think it is. I think you mean like just casual talking. Trash talking be like, Roland, I'm gonna kick his butt. We're gonna win today. That's trash talk.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Trash talking podcast.
Well, Olaf is rolling his eyes again, so I think that was borderline to it.
Borderline's where we should, that's a line I can live on.
Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast. In this show, we talk about our experiences and lessons learned in enterprise architecture and business process management. What's Your Baseline is designed to be for everyone. Newbies who are just getting started with these topics, organizations who want to improve their EA and BPM groups and the value they get from it, as well as practitioners who want to get a different perspective and care about the discipline.
Each episode will tackle different key topics, providing context, background, best practices, and stories from the road, inviting you to learn from our challenges and successes, and demonstrating key tools to help you set up your practice and get the most out of it.
I'm your host, Roland Wolt, and I'm joined today by my co-host, JM Erlinson.
Hey, JM, how are you doing today?
Not too bad, Roland. I don't know if people track the days we record these, the days we put this out, but I have to tell you, today is very special to me. Today is my birthday.
Ooh.
Yeah, I'm getting older, and with age, they say, comes wisdom, which is a perfect segue to today's topic. I can't believe we're doing this again.
Yeah, that's true. Another 10 things that we learned, But I can tell you out of my own experience, it's just a number. You don't get wiser. You just do the same stuff as before. You just got more arguments to hide and conceal the mistakes that you do.
I feel like I'm getting shortchanged now. I paid in a number, yet you get free wisdom that comes along with it, right?
Oh, well, we'll see. But hey, there's also another thing that's special with this episode.
What's that?
This episode is the one that actually will have the shortest timeline from recording to publishing, because we were super busy and super slow and super whatever this week. So we record this on a Saturday. For those of you listening to it, the Saturday just a few days ago. And interesting enough, we already have the next episode being recorded that we refer to, the episode that we spoke about a couple of days ago. So now we're in that time traveling mode, and I'm just wondering how we get out of that time loop.
Well, here's the thing, Roland. We can think of it as this is the most timely episode, the shortest distance between us learning the lessons and us teaching the lessons. Isn't that what we're looking for?
So, JM, we learned something, right? We already had 2 episodes where we learned something in season 1 and season 2. What did we learn in season 3, in the final episode of season 3?
Well, we've learned a lot of things. And of course, this is called 10 Things I've Learned. So we're going to go through the 10 things that Roland and I have come up with as lessons we're taking away from 2022 into 2023 as process and architecture and change professionals. And I think that's going to be talking a little bit about our first category today, which is how do we do things? How do we do things and how do we do them better? And in particular, I wanted to talk about the first thing I've learned this year, and perhaps in a year of a lot of shakeups, whether or not it be the continued Great Resignation or whether or not it be lots of layoffs in some of the large tech companies and companies going under and companies springing up. One of the most important things people are asking for, clamoring for, that I'm hearing is transparency. Mm-hmm. Transparency is more important than ever. And I have an expression that I like to say, is that I need to see tomorrow's newspaper today, so that when tomorrow's newspaper actually comes out, I'm not having an emotional response to the news. I have my emotional response today as I'm reading it. Mm-hmm. Then tomorrow when the paper comes out, I can address the challenges with the emotions behind me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Even though that's another weird time thing that I have to get my head around. I'm just wondering how many organizations actually follow that principle. Because in my experience, a lot of organizations, just like I made the joke about you learning more arguments to hide your mistakes, they act in the very same way. And the question is obviously, how do you change that culture? And by the way, what does it actually mean to be transparent? Because I think there's different levels in there, aren't they?
Yeah, there's a really good book. I've been reading a lot this year. And there's a book by Jim Whitehurst called Open Organization. We'll put a link to it in the show notes here, which talks about, the what, the how, and the why as we move from a conventional sort of top-down command organization, central planning organization, to a bottom-up, talking about purpose, passion, engagement, and giving people this the information, helping people find alignment. Rather than necessarily just, what do you fit into your role, but align. How do you align mindsets? And I think that's a part of that is about revealing some of the things that are normally obscured for reasons that I think are more protective than they are actually causing safety. Like people are worried about whether or not these announcements will be perceived badly. They need to have a sort of centralized decision-making body. They don't really want to find, input from other people to be able to help inform their decision. They don't want to iterate on their decision. They just want to say something, command, control, and then you shall do, rather than opening things up. And I think we need more visibility. In particular, we talk about process and architecture. We need more concrete visibility into either the future state that we're looking at, so for process, architecture, and organization, or into potential future states. So we can do an impact analysis. Everyone's doing personal impact analysis. What does this decision mean for me? What does this new way of doing business mean for me, my family, my life, my work? And being able to do that impact analysis on at a time when the decision has not gone into place yet means that you're able to better adapt to the changed organization that you're creating. So I love the quote, when we're thinking about culture, we should be thinking about alignment rather than fit. And I think culture extends to the rest of the organization, and process, architecture, and organization are very much a part of that.
Yeah, and when I think about the how of doing this, and we will talk about that later without spoiling it too much, right? When I look at the tools that we use to do architecture and to do process management, they're very much expert tools. Right. So things happen in a closet, or a conference room or whatever, on a hidden shared drive or wherever. And people just see the results. They're not involved in the actual decision making, or they don't see the different options that have been discussed and maybe not agreed to. Right. So I think transparency also means to be able to say, okay, I screwed up. I had the wrong idea, as manifested here, but we learned from it, right? And we, in the next iteration of that process, in the next iteration of that application landscape and so on and so forth, we're going to fix that mistake.
Yeah, I think we need to understand the narrative of change. Because when you see the story, you see the struggles, you understand what people have had to endure and how they've solved that, how they've come together, instead of just seeing the solution. I think you can put yourself in those shoes. You can empathize with the decision-making process that had to go into place. And perhaps more importantly, when you empathize with it, you can feel like you were a part of it, and you can more easily believe in it and make it part of your way of working. And that's not being done as much as I think really needs to be done. I'm seeing a lot of failures of obfuscation. People just hiding information, announcements coming out, people reacting emotionally, not being able to handle it. Sometimes it's 2-3 months before people can actually put these new practices into place, and sometimes they just decide, I'm done with this, and I can't handle this roller coaster of emotions that is happening as a result of these just bombshell revelations.
Yeah, and we already had multiple episodes around this topic, with Mirko and with Kasper in the past, that we also will put obviously links to the show notes. But that, Jam, brings me to the second point on the list of 10 things that we learned, because it's closely related. And the second point is that strategic alignment is more important than ever. Right. When you think about initiatives that failed, and they might be driven, just like you said, by those hidden mindsets, and then act or show themselves as the immunity to change, right? Then obviously you need, as an organization, go and make clear, we're doing this because of that, and it aligns to our purpose, it aligns to our strategy in this and that way. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah. There's a really good book, that, called Immunity to Change, Keegan Leahy. Really good book, that I would recommend, everyone. Once again, I've been reading a lot here. I recommend people taking a look at it. It talks about those hidden mindsets that are really the blockers of change and evolution. And it's not just, it's not just fear of change. It's existing hidden mindsets that are causing this misalignment and people not understanding things. And those come from the very top, and they roll downwards. And one of the things that I see a lot of our customers do, and really struggle with, is they simply draw processes. They say, listen, we want to change. What we're going to do is we're going to create a bunch of models that describe how we want to do things. And I say, okay, so how does this align with how the organization is changing? Well, this is just my job. I got to do this because I need to create this, this collateral or whatever. And I'm like, okay, but what is this going to do for the organization? And how is this going to align with the changes that are occurring strategically? Oh, well, we'll figure that out later.
Yeah.
Well, I understand you don't want to get, you don't want to jump both feet in on the strategy side first. You don't have to wait around until strategic models are finished to do your process modeling. But at the same time, you have to understand context. You have to be able to put this into the way the organization is going to be shaping itself. And otherwise, their strategic alignment is going to fail and your project is going to really struggle because it's going to lose stakeholder support. It's not going to have that backing of an organization that's behind it from a plan onward.
And what you mentioned in my mind is just one part of it, because you said stop just drawing processes, right? So do the planning for it. You actually need to take action. Your idea, as good as bad as it might be, is worth nothing, right? And there's a nice book written by Jason Fried, when we're talking about books. And he's one of the founders of Basecamp, the tool. And he came with an idea to say, okay, you actually have two things. You have the idea that you have, and you can rate that on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 is super bad idea. 5 is excellent, earth-shattering, awesome idea. But then you have the same 1 to 5 scale on the other side in regards to your execution. 1 is poorly executed or not executed, and 5 is super awesome, best execution in the world. And you just need to multiply those two. Right. So from that perspective, a really bad idea, super well executed, obviously could have a good impact, right? And vice versa. So I think what we need to look at, and I think that's the point that I want to make, is yes, it's important to see the context. Yes, it's important to see the purpose. Yes, it's important to see how it's aligned. But then you need to talk about how do you bring the rubber to the road. And there are things, if this is the Bring Back Old Podcast episode reference show, then you see things what we discussed in season 2 about org change management, or when we spoke with Lori in season 3 about how to communicate architecture results. These are all things that come into this and that go past whatever the strategic alignment. But I don't want to take away from it, because it is important that you align.
I get it, absolutely, and I think that's a really good point to remember. But also, I think that one of the things you're trying to do is, I disagree a little bit on the idea of a really bad idea implemented really well has the potential to be good. I mean, I feel like there is a check valve, right? There's I would think of it as a threshold. Mm-hmm. Yes, you can have a scale of how well it's implemented, but under a threshold of an idea, that idea shouldn't be implemented.
I'm with you. I think it was just to illustrate the multiplication, right? Because in my example, it would be the value would be 5, versus you have the super awesome idea that you do not implement, where the value is a 0. So I think that was the point that I want to make, which brings me, my friend, to our third point, which means sometimes you have to say no to stupid ideas.
Yeah, it's something that I've come across this year a couple times, and I've had to learn. So there is that old adage, the client is always right. And I feel like a lot of organizations take that not just to heart, but they take that into the product management and product development, particularly when you're looking at platform services and consulting services. And sometimes the conversations with a client aren't necessarily collaborative. They're directive. And a client says, I need this to work this way and I need it to do this. And why? Because that's the way that I need it to do things. That's part of my own change management strategy. It's part of my own organizational bias. And I've learned this year that is not always good. In fact, you should sometimes say no. So, for instance, if a client asks for a feature in your tool, you should say, no, that we're not going to do that. And there's a reason why. Not only is it very difficult, you can't possibly adapt to all your client requirements. Number two, I think is more strategic in its conversation. I think that when you're an organization, a mature organization, or an organization that has hired people who have strategic context and understand the industry, understand practices very well, changing those practices takes away from some of the value from why you're there. Why you're there is not to serve their biases necessarily. It's to serve their strategic aims. Their biases are often getting in the way of those. So if they say it has to look a certain way, a button has to work a certain way, what they're doing is they're airing out dirty laundry from things that have failed in the past for them or they've struggled with at a functional level that you'll end up having to spend a bunch of time working on rather than actually solving their strategic challenges and mapping on your practices and your best practices and your functionality so that it's a catalyst for change in their organization. Remember that any part of our organization, between like bringing in a new platform or bringing in a new practice as a consulting, you're trying to act as a catalyst for your end customer because you're never going to change everything in that organization. You don't have the people, you don't have the time, and they certainly don't have the budget. You need to be that catalyst that helps them change themselves. And by just doing what they say, man, you're just going to let them continue to operate in a way that led them to have to hire you. Don't do that. Say no. Let them change.
I think there's two aspects that come to mind. One is when you see it from a vendor perspective. We produce software, both of our respective companies. You should have, and that's a big thing on our side, you should have a vision of your tool. Who is it for? Right. What problems do you solve? What's the enlightenment that users have? So one of the books that I currently pull out a lot is called Value Proposition Design by Alex Osterwalder, from business model generation fame from 15 years ago. But anyways, so it's all about, okay, what's the value that you bring to it with your tool? That's one thing. The other thing is one of the leading practices that I see organizations when they implement our tools is they should come up with personas. And the personas, which basically depicting their targets, subjects, when you do that, you should, just like you said, take a step away and say, okay, I don't prescribe when creating the personas how the tool shall be configured. I prescribe or describe the outcome, right? And then while we're doing this in an agile fashion or however, right, we iterate to the best possible outcome that we can do, given the constraints that we have, like timelines and stakeholder availability and what else might come up with.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And you're not negotiating necessarily on the outcomes. The outcomes are part of the value proposition you bring.
Yep.
Like you've determined through a market scan or through industry best practice knowledge that these are outcomes that organizations succeed better when they have in their organization. And so you're like, we need to get you here. Yeah. I want that more of that this year and more saying more in these next year. I want to say more saying no and and less having to say no. Yep. I think that's one of the things we established in our relationship is and I learned this from my mother when I was very young is that she said I don't have any clients. I have partners. Mm-hmm. I have people I like to work with. And it's like, well, I mean, technically they're paying you. She's like, yeah, but this is a two-way street. They want as much as I want for this to be successful. And they're getting paid from other sources. They have income that comes in as a result of the success that we bring together. Yeah. So it's really everyone is just working for the same goal. We can't just see it as a client-servant. It's a servant like master relationship. That's not kind of how it goes.
Yeah, but
and that leads me to the number 4 of our points for today. Because because I know we're starting to creep up on the first section being already more than 20 minutes. Hilarious. But this is something that I've come across a couple times this year, and I need to learn and perhaps take into 2023 a lot stronger. Is at the outset of a project, we need to be very clear on defining how to show that value, how to test that value, and we need to have run a test case for making sure that value creation, that value measurement is going to work. I had a couple of instances this year where they had a bunch of metrics. They said, this is how we know we'll be successful. They were a little wishy-washy, but they also hadn't been tested. So they had no idea whether or not those metrics were actually going to be able to be tested, and whether or not the change was something that they could actually justify after the fact, because they hadn't tried it in a smaller scale and they didn't really know how to make that justification stick. And so they went through a project and they said, yeah, we feel like it's better. Well, we're not doing phase 2. And I'm like, what? But the project was successful. Yeah, but I mean, we feel like it's better, but yeah, we don't actually have any numbers that would prove that that's the case. I said, well, we can bring business value engineering. Well, I mean, you don't really have the data you can measure. There's nothing you can't really like show you what's going on. So, well, I mean, great working with you.
There's one of my favorite podcasts. They had an episode about how to create a business case. I forgot, two bearded guys were talking about that in episode 20 something. And I think this is exactly the point, right? You need to have an idea of the end in mind. And then you need to figure out, okay, how do I measure that I was successful? Because you just don't declare victory because you feel like that. You must somehow prove it, right? And when I think at the different metrics that you could see, whatever, time-based, did we achieve what we wanted to do in a certain time, or did we create the stuff that we wanted to create in the quality that we wanted, or were we compliant to whatever the regulations and the laws tell us to do? These are all things that need to be put in context. And I think your example that you just shared is somebody didn't do his homework, and we might want to point him to that What's Your Baseline episode.
Well, I mean, it's the business case is good, and I do like developing a value proposition, but being able to actually test that value proposition will hold. Because I feel like a lot of value propositions are purely academic, up until the point where you sell the product, you sell the service, and then you run it and you go, oh, what was that value proposition again? And it's like, no. Let's make sure that this would actually show real progress. Yeah. Otherwise, no one's going to believe that the project was successful. And I've seen that happen a couple of times.
So besides the fact that there's also a shorts of the same group that created that business case thing that talked about proof of values, right, which would be your testing exercise. I see the very same thing when I talk with clients about process mining, right? Because when I ask them about what do you want to accomplish, what are your objectives, I typically see a big black nothing, right, in their eyes, like, and then they come back with things like, oh yeah, we want to improve our operational efficiency. Somebody read their business administration book, their economics book over the weekend. And I said, that's great, but can you break that down into some hypothesis? Why do you think your operational efficiency is not good when you look at this process that we just looked at? And then they draw another blank. So it's always hard to articulate what you want to accomplish. And it might be even harder to find the right metrics to say, yes, we accomplished our objectives or we didn't.
Yeah. Well, speaking about accomplishing our objectives, I think we've been able to get through this first section.
Yay.
Yeah. So we'll leave you with a couple of minutes to think about what we talked about: getting transparency, achieving strategic alignments, saying no, and holding your practices and platforms strong, and making it clear where value is going to be achieved. Not just seeing a big number of ROI from some other client, but making it so that it works for you. You can test it, and so when it's time to actually show value back, you have a good number you can rely on. We'll leave you for a second and come back with our second section, tools.
Hey, welcome back to section number 2 of this episode. And like JM teased a little bit before the break, in this case, we're going to talk about tools, right? Which is sometimes the dead horse that you beat all over the place, because as we all agreed upon, it's not the tool that makes the success of your project. But on the other side, if you don't use the right tool, you have a much harder time to reach your goals. So I think the first lesson that at least I've learned is over the last 25 plus years is that BPM and EA software is still too nerdy for the average user. What do you think?
I'm sad to hear it, but it is true. And I think that there is, we both work at tool vendors that sell BPM and EA software. And I see this a lot in my clients. They say, I can't share this with the average person. Mm-hmm. And there are definitely, ways of reducing your interface. There are ways of making it easier to extract information in more familiar formats for people who don't get it. But if you're asking people to understand process models, you're still too much right now for a lot of people. If you're asking people to design process models using clicking boxes onto the page, there are still a lot of people for whom that is just hard to get into. And maybe they don't have the background or training. Maybe this just is confusing. They're not a visual learner. And maybe that's just not something that's interesting to them. And that's a problem.
I liked what Lori said in the first show of this season. It feels like ages ago, where she said the people should not go to the information needs to go to the people. And I think this is a paradigm shift, because right now a lot of the things that you see in EA tools is just working in the background. So the question is, how do you not only make the process more accessible for people to contribute to, or how do you make notations? And in season 4, we will most likely talk with one inventor of a different notation. How do you make that less geeky? And at the end of the day, how do you make the outcome, the artifact that you create, less geeky, so that it can be consumed by more people? Because if you have to go to have the negative example, if you have to go to a special website and you need a super secret login just to see it, and then you see boxes and arrows and you don't see the content and you don't see the strategic alignment and you don't see the requirements and all that stuff that we spoke about in segment 1, most likely they look at it and say, oh yeah, nice diagram, right? And that was about it. So I think that's a big challenge for software vendors to figure out how do you get out of that nerdy niche without losing all the benefits that standard notations and standard approaches have.
Yeah, I liken this to, I like to use the phrase like a duck. You want to have on the surface of the water, it needs to look serene and easy and simple and beautiful. You've seen a duck floating around in a pond. It's quite a majestic animal. But then under the water, those legs are paddling away like crazy. That's okay. Like, you can have all that nerdy, that powerful, that really intense stuff happening under the surface, but it needs to feel nice, beautiful, elegant above the surface. And that's the other thing is I think a lot of organizations get caught up in the loudest people, who are the architects and the process modelers, who are yelling about features and functions and power and cross analysis and reporting and getting value through data manipulation. But the quiet people are walking away, which is all your end users, all the people you're trying to reach. We need to change that focus of our the spotlight here. And I know that a lot of platforms are trying to do that. It's this continuum, right? You're trying to get a continuum of complexity, a continuum of capability. At the highest level, you're giving everyone access to all the features and functions of the most powerful platform that they can imagine. And over a sliding scale of capability, over a sliding scale of complexity, different people have access to different interfaces that tailor to that persona's need. And I think we talked about this before as like you use the word persona. That's really important. Persona-based analysis of capability is something that we're looking at doing more and more as platform vendors, and hoping that those persona-based analysis of capability will help to create, once again, a continuum of profiles that have different sets of expectations of skill, different sets of ability to view, different sets of ability to control, and different technical requirements required to get them on board.
Yeah.
So less nerds, more everyman.
I agree. And I think the keyword here is relevancy. And I haven't seen that in any tool. How do you package the information that you have in your databases, right, that exists there for 20, 30 years? How do you package that only the relevant stuff will be shown to the person who's requesting this information, right? Without all the hassle to go through folders and go to mining platforms and filter and whatever you have to do. I think that's a big thing that vendors need to think about. How do they make things a little bit more friendlier? Which brings me to the second point of our conversation, right? One thing that I noticed is when you go into an architecture tool or in a mining tool or in an automation tool, you need to click around like crazy, right? People can't get to the stuff that they want to do. And I think they should be there in 3 clicks or less. JM, you as an employee of a software vendor, how do we get there?
That's actually a very specific number I received from a client this year, which was 3 clicks or less. Because you, in service to helping people who are not going to be your tech heads, who are able to navigate across the large span of stuff you have to find what they want by tailoring the views, you need to give people a guided path to finding whatever they need in your repository of architecture and process in 3 clicks or less. So how have I seen this work? First and foremost, it's about persona-based experience and user experience maps. Essentially, we draw customer journeys for what does it mean for each persona to access the platform within which you would draw persona maps and you would draw process models.
Ew.
How do I make it so all of those paths, all those journey paths, they all only have 3 steps? Well, first and foremost, we understand all the journeys. Secondly, we need to have entry points. So configured entry points based on role that give you a very quick narrowing of scope. I feel like it's kind of like an algorithm, a search algorithm for like a search engine. You want to have a quick narrowing of scope and re-rendering of views. So that's all role-based permissions to make sure that whatever home screens or dashboards are just the ones they need, and then plain language navigation buttons that take you down the level that you need to go to an area that gives you a selector menu for the second click. And then the third click is something that they can open up just a view that's relevant to them. And you will do that not just on those personas. Those personas also need to be relatively tight. So you're thinking about personas as a user group. Those user groups can be actually very small. There is a bit of an administrative challenge to this because you're obviously having to have multiple different groups applied to different people, and it can get complicated on the back end from an administration perspective, but that's a price I'm willing to pay. Like, I'm willing to have my admins work double time so that my common users can work half time, because by utility, that math works out an unbelievable amount. I have 5 admins and I have 5,000 end users.
Which also means, and now I think I get stoned by all those purists, which also means the tools need to change in a way that you have way more auto-rendered models. So all those guys like me who love to push pixels and to make things look pretty and whatnot, those models sometimes can be really, really complex. And there's a lot of non-relevant stuff for users in there. So the question is, how can you take that information that's stored in the database where you have the sequential information and the role information and all that type of stuff? How can you have the tool display only the relevant stuff for you. Because the super nerd, the business analyst, they might want to see the big thing, the big picture. But as an end user, do you really care if your end-to-end process that had, like, one client of mine had about 1,000 steps to go through? Do they really care about the 1,000 steps or just the 5 that they are involved in?
Yeah, that's the highlighting, that sort of narrowing of scope of what you actually need to care about. And also understanding what people want. Like, not everyone wants to see that. And that leads us to our third point for the tools, which I feel like you can't. Everyone on our podcast obviously can't see our Notion page, but I put a bunch of stuff in all caps because this is something I really learned this year. Is people need resources for self-service. Mm-hmm. You just need self-service resources, and I'm not talking about epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh of manuals. No more 5,000 page manuals you got to read through. No more boilerplate training classes that don't actually matter to you. We need things people can interact with dynamically that allow them to get everything they need. Because right now, more than any other time in my life, I'm finding that my clients are all just trying to help themselves. And they don't want this sort of put upon burden of taking these, like, instructor-led training classes that go on forever, or these governance review sessions that are all manual with people trying to tell them what to do. They want to be able to check their own models. They want to be able to find their own information. They want interactive guides. They want videos, and they want automation with prompts as they're working to tell them where to click next, because they'll do that if they're given it. But if they don't have those resources, it's the first path to frustration. Because if you open up a 3,000 page manual, you're not going to read it. You're going to close it, and you're going to close the tool.
Yeah, but that is first of all, I agree. Second thing, I think that's a consequence of the lack of attention span that we have. And one can mourn about this or not. But I agree on this. And if I can talk about the organization in that I'm currently working, we do exactly that thing, right? So we're using, for example, in our software, a tool called WalkMe. And I know that you guys at Software G, I forgot the name, something with a G, use a similar tool to do tours and all that stuff, right? Where we put this in. And also if something's new, you get those highlights. And then on the other side, we're also currently building out a learning management system with exactly that idea. And if Olaf listens to our show here, one of our friend, Olaf Geyer, if you listen to that, I can see your eye rolling again. So we came up with our training curriculum and visualize it in a subway map, right? So that you can say, I hop on this train, I go through the overview lane just to see on the different stops, is that topic something for me? Is process mining something for me? Am I a partner? Is the partner program for me? And if it is, I switch to another line and then go through the content there. And I have intersections where I can then jump to another top, whatever. So enabling that self-guided walkthrough as I need it as an end user. I think I'm 100% with you. That's very, very important to do this.
Yeah. Funny enough, actually, you mentioned subway maps. It's not on our list, but I just saw a subway map you showed me, and subway maps are cool.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if that's a 10 things I've learned, but I've seen a couple of different things modeled in subway map format. And sure, it's not as disciplined as like a BPMN or whatever, but like, it's a very functional way of visualizing what to do next, where to get on, how to get off. Like that's a pretty good little tool. So that's a bonus 10 thing I've learned.
I agree, but JM, I do not recommend that you Google how to create a subway map. This is a rabbit hole that you don't want to go down into. Transitsmaps.com, where you can learn about all that stuff and all the history and all these things. Very interesting, but super nerdy.
So another bonus 10 thing I've learned, don't go down an internet hole until you reach the bottom and you've been spending hours making stuff.
Don't Google how to create a subway map as the bonus lesson learned.
here's the thing. We're nerds. Like,
Yeah.
hey, friends on our audience, surprise. As if you didn't know already. The two of us are nerds. We're going to do weird stuff that we love and go down these internet holes and make beautiful models. Not everyone has to have that, but honestly, sometimes it's pretty dope. I got to say that. I like it a lot.
I find it super relaxing. You know, I will not share which tool I use to create the subway map that I use for our training. PowerPoint. Yeah, that was awesome.
Heartbreak.
Yeah, heartbreak. But it's super relaxing because it forces you, and that's why I also love to use mind maps. You know, it forces you to structure your thoughts. How are things wired up? How do they belong together? So to give you an example, we have a modeling platform in our tool stack, and we use BPMN as a notation. So then comes the critical question: do you put the BPMN information into a tool class, or do you create what I did, a concept line, and you place that BPMN thing on the concept line because it's an industry concept?
Yeah.
Right. And all that stuff. It's awesome because you're forced to think about this.
Yeah. I do want to loop back on something you said earlier, though, because I think that you said about people are like, the attention span is getting, and you said that a couple of times on the podcast. And I think you're right, but there's also a market pressure for this. So I have a nephew, really nice guy, learning about a bunch of stuff. He's trying to get into mechatronics, and one of the things we talk about is how is he learning that in high school? Because I know mechatronics in high school is hit and miss. And I talked to his dad and my half brother, and he was like, "Oh, he's taking all of his classes, quote unquote, on YouTube. And it's all on YouTube." And people are doing this, self-serving. They're just going to YouTube. There's so many tutorials out there. You can learn as much as you want from that. Or even if you're going to professional management platforms for knowledge, like I'm on Udemy. We're not sponsored by them. If they want to sponsor us, feel free to do so. But Udemy is a bunch of self-service learning courses just ready to go for you. Everyone's trying to self-serve their knowledge these days, and honestly, I'm for it.
Oh yeah.
So more and more vendors, you need to be self-service.
I remember when my kids were in middle school, like, oh, how do you calculate a slope again? And I just went to Khan Academy, and I said, oh yeah, this is you count the little squares on your graph paper, and you get the slope, that just tells you how old I am. I wish there was a similar concept when my younger son did his AP Latin test. There is no equivalent for Khan Academy for Latin AP, unfortunately. And I couldn't help because my last Latin class was like 35 years ago.
Actually, I have a fun story because this is the end of the year. We're telling fun stories. So I used to work at a summer camp, which was a really amazing facility. It's a Centauri Summer Arts Camp. It's a arts training facility that used to have a physical presence over every summer. Now it's just actually not just. It's a really cool arts training facility here in Toronto. And we had an event once called Latin Club, and everybody got dressed up, ready to go, as if it was like Latin music, and it was great. And there was a lot of beautiful stuff. And one of my friends showed up in I think some form of toga, and at her school she was part of, I think, maybe one of the only members of the Latin Club, which is people who just know how to speak Latin. Yeah, and I was like, oh, I see what you did there. It's funny, and I think we're all having fun with this. And she danced the night away, but it was like, yeah, Latin is two things.
That's
two things, so I love it.
That's what Carl did as well, And then the language Latin, right? The class they went bowling. And then they all showed up in bed sheets as togas and whatnot on the bowling track, Yep.
Well, wonderful. Well, a little shout out to my friend Tank. She knows who she is. Well, meanwhile, we're going to leave you with another quick break after our tools section. The lessons we've learned in this one, which is BPM and EA software, is still too nerdy for the average user. Number 2 is that people need to get information in 3 clicks or less. That you need to have pathways for people to be able to find what they need to know. And number 3 is we need to create more self-service resources, not human-driven.
And number 4 is not to Google how to create subway maps.
We'll leave you for a moment, and we'll come back with our final section. Where does the industry go?
All right, JM. Hey, we spoke about how to do things and we spoke about tools. Now, in our last segment of this show, I like to bring it a level up. JM, tell me from your perspective, where does our industry go?
Yeah, I've been saying this as far as wide as I possibly can, but our eighth of their 10 things I've learned is that data-driven decision-making is going to be the way of the future. It's currently the way of the present, but I think more and more data-driven or evidence-based decision-making is how people are going to make decisions on large-scale process and architecture change. It just has to be that way because finally, we have enough data. We know how to use that data. We have tools that will allow us to process that data. And we have people who in leadership positions who believe in data, that it's going to be our North Star. It just will be.
I agree. What I see today is seeing that used in the as-is analysis, process mining and all these things. What I predict will be something like a renaissance of forward-looking things, like simulation. Because now, I'm one of the harshest critics of all those concepts, of digital twin and all these things. But I think now, today, we're at a point where this thing actually can become a reality. Right, where you actually go and you have the data and you use, for example, a simulation tool and it shows you automatically the different futures that you have. Right, so you not only have evidence-based decision-making in the analysis to say, oh yeah, this stinks, but you also have evidence-based decision-making in what's the right path forward. And in my experience, tools like simulation are completely underrated. I barely see customers in the past of mine who have used that.
I'd agree. And I think that part of the reason the simulation was not used is that you didn't have the data in a fidelity you could trust.
Oh, yeah.
Like you'd have say, I know how long that takes. No, you don't. You're making it up.
Yeah.
You're guessing. Or time and motion studies that were unbelievably expensive, and they would only do them once, and they would be incomplete or incorrect. And that simulation wasn't really that effective because it was just garbage in.
Yeah,
right?
I agree.
But now we have good.
I think this operational intelligence information, I think that's the key thing here. But what I think we will also see is when you think about the last episode that we had with Ron talking about Six Sigma, you will see that coming back as well. People want to be precise and they want to know, okay, what's the variances in all those things there. So my prediction, data-driven decision-making will become more important going forward.
And that leads us to our second, which is a question around the future of process mining. Because process mining as a discipline and as a platform has been its own market for the past, 10 years or so. I mean, I know it's longer than that, but since it's become a term and something popularized in the marketplace, it's been its own market. It's been its own tool set. It feels more and more like that's starting to get purposely blurred into the whole business transformation suite. Tell me about your thoughts on the future process mining.
I want to be very, very clear. In my opinion, process mining as its own software category will disappear in the next 3 to 5 years, which obviously is a big problem for some pure players, but hey, good for us. I think what we see is when you think about the things like the Gartner hype cycle, I think we have reached or are about to reach that first peak, where things then go down, people get disillusioned. And I've had a couple of customers who were using our competitor software, got charged an arm and a leg for it, and said, we just don't get the value out of it. We're looking for something that's more economically feasible or better integrated into tools that can do something that the pure player can't do.
And we've seen that in acquisitions, right?
Oh, tons of them.
A lot of process mining platforms
have
been bought up. I mean, we sat down with Mineit.
Yeah. Oh,
and James.
Yeah,
that's not Mineit anymore.
Yeah, our company bought Lockpicker, for example, right? So I think you see that market consolidation as well, which is also a sign on there. And I think that's a big challenge. So my prediction is the process mining market, and I just painfully remember how we assembled all the stuff for the Gartner Magic Quadrant, doing videos and writing long documents and all that stuff. I think that will go away in the really foreseeable future, not in the far future, but relatively close, 3 or 5 years. And process mining will just become another tool in the analyst's tool set.
Yeah, and an expected tool as well. Like I feel like as much as it goes away as a feature, like that's to talk about the feature cycle. Remember when power windows were a feature in a car?
Yeah.
Can you imagine these days buying a car with manual roll down and roll up windows? No. I feel like process mining will be just an expectation. How do you do business process analysis and improvement? Well, we start with process mining, we do some process analysis, we do some simulation of what if scenario creation, and then we make some decisions, and then we implement the process with automation and people change. Like that's how it's going to just be. And one of those words was process mining, and it just gets buried in the normal practice.
Yeah, and
that seems to make sense.
I agree. By the way, I know a car that I would buy with manual AC, as I like to call it. Because
is it a Lamborghini?
No, it would be a Jeep Wrangler, and I would take off the doors and drive without doors, or put some tube doors on it or whatever, right? So when you don't have windows, you don't need electric power windows. But I think there's a whole, if we stick with the car example, there's a whole subsequent industry around this. Because what we see, which I find super interesting, and I hope we get her as a guest in our next episode, I see the whole topic around data preparation as a problem that has not been solved yet. I think it's still too nerdy, like, you need to be able to write some SQL-ish code, or however the vendor call it. That's not for the mere mortal. It's not for the regular business analyst. This is something for an IT-focused person. So the question is, how do you do the data preparation, creation of your data model, connectivity to source systems and all that stuff? How do you make that simpler? How do you make that being doable for the average Joe and not the expert? So how do you bring, how our company calls it, how do you bring process intelligence to the masses? That will be an interesting challenge. And then lastly, I think in this, you obviously still will see some pure players, right? Because that's what they do. The question is, where do they evolve, and will they meet their market objectives? And you will see some academic tools like Apromore, for example, where universities, rightfully so, still research that topic and bring in new ideas and develop new algorithms and all that type of stuff, where you need those tools. So it will not go completely away, but from a commercial perspective, I think process mining will disappear as its own thing.
Yeah, and as its own thing. I think it'll be sold alongside other things. And we talked a little bit about knowledge along the way, and that leads us to our last of the 10 things I've learned this year. Another 10 things I've learned. And I've run across this a lot. We talked about this idea of the Great Resignation. We talked about the layoffs, and there's been some pretty public fail cases of this next 10 things I've learned, which is that it seems like for some reason people have really forgotten about the practice of knowledge management and knowledge retention. I don't know what happened. I don't know why they stopped doing it. When I talk to companies that, my clients, and they talk about people just walking out the door with years of knowledge that they just haven't laid down, or there was a series of layoffs, and now no one knows how to do some core functions of the business. I wonder why that happened, or what happened. I guess people don't want to look back, or they don't want to create collateral that they think has no value. But boy, it's really cost some of the folks I work with this year a lot, like not a small amount of money, like a significant amount of money to have to come in and have people do assessments on how their business works. I talked about this as an issue of process debt. As in, you have a whole bunch of processes that are running, some of them in automation, some of them in manual, distributed over a bunch of stakeholders. And process debt means you don't know how those processes work. You're just running them, hoping that they don't shut off mysteriously one day. That's knowledge management.
Yeah, there's two things I think that are there. I don't think it's the individuals, to be quite honest, right? I think the two factors that we see is, one, the short-sightedness and the short-term drivenness, if that's a word, of business today, Oh yeah, we don't have time for this. We need to do something more important, right? That doesn't stop, or that doesn't make people stop and write down what they do, right? And we see a lot of those guys go, right? This is the time where all the boomers go into retirement, When you think about it, if we want to talk generations, I'm an early generation Xer, right? And in 10 years from now, I might think about retirement, right? So it's not that far away. On this, but there's a lot of brain drain going on, right? And the second thing is, it's sometimes that childish belief that technology will solve everything. And to the previous point, yes, process mining can recreate what happened in your systems, but what you're missing is context. What you're missing, and think about, and we spoke about that before. When you think about, you have data that needs to be transformed into information that then leads into knowledge. But the one thing that's missing is the wisdom. So knowledge is knowing what to do. Wisdom is knowing when not to do it, right? So I think that is exactly the part that we're missing, right? The context information that those guys who've run processes 30, 40 years, who worked in certain industries for that time frame, that will just walk out the door. That technology, at least today, cannot capture.
Yeah, and I know in the past that there's been some worry about you hold the knowledge so that it gives you job security, but there's a lot of reasons why that's a falsehood. And also, it's not giving you job security. You're getting fired or you're leaving.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's with the idea of you can't take it with you, right? You can't take your knowledge, you can't take your jewels to the grave, you can't take your knowledge to the grave. It doesn't do anything for you. So give it away in some senses, give it to people, pass it on, put it like that. And in doing so, you're going to create a better organization that you can work in while you're still working there, and then you're going to provide a gift to those once you've left of your wisdom and experience retained as organizational capital. And it's not like you should be giving gifts to corporations necessarily, but rather to say that's just a nice thing to do because they're full of humans who are working, who want to know what in the world this system does and how it works and how this process was supposed to go. So knowledge retention, knowledge management.
Having said that, I appreciate that you have those, that you have adapted those morbid German proverbs in slightly different words. But the other thing is, and that's, you mentioned, where did knowledge management go? I think it's the same thing that we discussed when we were talking about architecture a little bit above. The tools don't support the easy capture, the easy update, and all these things. And I think this makes it hard, because how many intranet initiatives have you seen in your life? How many wikis have been set up and just fell asleep in your professional career, right? And it's the chicken and the egg problem, right? Everybody wants to use it, but nobody wants to contribute to it, right? And then at some point in time, it's getting outdated. Yeah. So I think that is also a thing. How can we capture information that people might have in their brain very easily, right? So that it happens, quote unquote, on the side, right?
Well, let's move all the way back to the very beginning here, which is the word transparency.
Yeah.
One of the things about transparency is it allows you to celebrate each other's achievements. And if we're celebrating achievements, and part of those achievements are process-based, so you're improving a process or practice, you're changing a tool, it has different ways of, business rules of how it's supposed to work. If we open that up, there's also, as a management style, they talk about things like radical candor. Mm-hmm. But let's take a look at a technology radical candor, which is let's be honest and open with each other. Let's give each other very clear, no offense, sort of, but really important feedback on what's being developed. Let's continuously update each other on it. Let's be proud of our achievements together. And once you have a culture of sharing, now you can start to actually develop a culture of knowledge retention, real good knowledge retention.
Yeah, but that has one requirement that I haven't seen a lot, unfortunately. And we spoke about that with Mirko. It's trust.
Trust.
Right. Yeah. How do you create a culture of trust? Right. You don't want to be caught with your pants down. Right. So you rather don't do anything than somebody laughing at you and or worse. And that is the big challenge that I see. And with the short-term orientation that I see and all that stuff, that's all not helpful for building trust. And to bring this episode to a close, as all those tech podcasts that we listen to and that we like, even our episode here today comes back to the only point. It's all about the people. It's not technology, it's the people that are the problem.
And of course, that means that people have to be the solution.
Of course.
People being the solution, friends, that means that you're part of the solution. So we're going to leave you for one moment to listen to one last piece of beautiful music from our friend Jeremy Voltz, who you will hear from a little later on this week.
Ooh, spoiler alert.
And we will come back with our conclusions and the end of the episode.
Welcome back to the last segment of the last show of the last season in this year. But don't be afraid, there will be another season coming next year. Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
And just like to walk us through the, which I can't believe that we have another 10 things that we've learned. So we structured this episode in 3 things. The first one was how to do things. We spoke about that transparency is more important than ever, that strategic alignment is key to your success, that sometimes you have to say no to your client requirements, and that you have to make clear at the outset how a project will be measured and figure out what the success was. Then we switched over to tools, and we had 3 things plus 1 bonus thing that we learned during this episode, right? The first one is that our architecture and process management software is still too nerdy. So how do we make it easier for folks to get into the game? And that the tools need to be simpler. How do you get to an information in 3 clicks or less, which I really, really like. And then the third one was, well, how do you provide self-serve help resources, right? How do you avoid the 3,000-page flat manual JM, right? And the boilerplate trainings and all that stuff. And the bonus thing that we learned was, do not Google how to create subway maps. And then in the last section, a couple of minutes ago, we just started talking about where does the industry go? Data-driven becomes more important, so there will be a renaissance of simulation and other forward-looking tools. Process mining as its own category will disappear in the next foreseeable future, 3 to 5 years. And then the last thing is we might think about knowledge management and how do we retain the knowledge of all of our colleagues who rightfully and fully deserved go into retirement in the near future. Jam, did I miss something?
No, I think you hit them all on the head. And honestly, folks, it's been a really fun time recording these podcasts over the past year. And I'm so excited, as Roland mentioned, we are continuing on to season 4, starting up in the new year. So look forward to some more What's Your Baseline fun. All the topics, all the guests we pulled in from across the industry with some really fascinating topics and some really great thought leadership. We invite you to continue to join us. And speaking of joining us, you can find out more about What's Your Baseline with companion articles, lots of great information, including things like giving us feedback, hello@whatsyourbaseline.com, but all of it at whatsyourbaseline.com. And for this episode specifically, whatsyourbaseline.com/episode 37, where you'll find the show notes, including some of the links to the books we mentioned, as well as a lot of information about what we talked about today. Well, until next year, well, actually, until a few days from now when we have a special bonus episode for you, I've been J.M. Erlandson.
And my name is Roland Volt.
And we will see you next year.